Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Friends of Fort Hunter lecture series. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Stephen Burg from Shippensburg University, who has joined us tonight to speak on lessons we can learn from Pennsylvania's African-American cemeteries and burial grounds. A couple housekeeping things. There is a time, hopefully, at the end for questions and answers. So if you have questions and you want to put them in the chat function, someone will check that out and try to get the questions, as many as we can, to Dr. Burg at the end. I have put the website for the Friends of Fort Hunter or Fort Hunter in general there in the chat function, and then we'll be reminded again at the end of that website if you want to check out more of the information and also how to join the Friends of Fort Hunter. So we'd be delighted if you would join us on the various activities that all have to do with raising funds and benefiting the Fort Hunter Mansion and Park. I'm very pleased that we have Dr. Stephen Burg with us tonight. He is professor of history at Shippensburg, as I said. He directs the undergraduate public history program there. He also teaches in the applied history graduate program. From 2013 to 2019, he served as a member of the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Board. He is active with the Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds, working to document, preserve, and share the history of African-American cemeteries in Pennsylvania, especially the final resting places of the veterans of the United States colored troops. I know him as a wonderful colleague and friend, and I'm looking very forward, as I hope the rest of you are, to hear his talk this evening, and I will turn things over to him.
Well, Barbara, first let me just say it's such a pleasure to be here tonight, and I want to thank you. I want to thank the Friends of Fort Hunter, Dauphin County Parks and Recreation for having me here tonight. It's just great, and I'm looking over the list of folks who are here. It's just a really amazing group of people. So I'm very pleased to be here and grateful to see so many friends, family, current and former students, and colleagues who work on history and preservation with me in so many different ways. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen here, so just give me a moment to get this all set up. Okay, perfect. So tonight, I have to say, it's just a pleasure for me to be able to present for the Friends of Fort Hunter. I am a huge fan of Fort Hunter. I have, over the years, enjoyed watching the progress of the archaeological digs. I have been a fan of the folk festival, and whenever I'm in Harrisburg and have a few free moments, I love to relax and daydream along the banks of the Susquehanna. So thank you for the work you do maintaining and preserving the park. It's just a real treasure. One of the things, though, I wanted to start off with tonight is that for those of you who are familiar with Fort Hunter Park, it's important to remember that that is not just a lovely park and a beautiful historic site, but it's also a site where fellow humans were owned by other humans, forced to work without compensation, and a place where men and women were bought and sold as livestock, denied the ability to make basic choices about their lives, and forced to work without their consent for people who owned the land and legally owned them. It's also a place, this park that we enjoy, is also a place where slavery, after it gradually ended after 1780, some of those African-American men and women chose to stay in the area and build their new lives of freedom here. They worked on the grounds, they raised families, they lived out their days as part of this community. The African-American history of Fort Hunter is an integral part of this community's history, Dauphin County's history, Pennsylvania history, and American history, just as African-American history more generally is inseparable from American history. To its credit, Fort Hunter does a great job of sharing this story. The history is present on its website. There's signage at the park that tells the story of slavery for those who are willing to seek it out and take the time to educate themselves. Moreover, one of the things I really like about the signage at Fort Hunter is it not only talks about the experience of enslaved people at Fort Hunter, but also talks about puts that in the context of Pennsylvania slavery and United States slavery as well, and also gives names to the men and women who were known to be enslaved at Fort Hunter. For me, I'm a historian. One of my areas of specialty is historic preservation. And for me, the work of trying to preserve historic buildings, sites, landscapes is really important, because one of the things that I care about is not just history abstractly, but I really care deeply about people connecting to history. And I understand that when you walk the grounds where our forebears walked, when you occupy the spaces where they occupied, you know history in a different way and you connect with it in a different way. A lot of my work has focused on historic cemeteries. Historic cemeteries are really powerful places for me. As a little kid, I used to love to wander and explore cemeteries. They, for me, are sacred ground where we can reflect and connect to the lives and spirits of those who lived before us. And now for almost 2 decades, I've been working with amazing people across the state and actually across the country as well, who have been focused on studying, exploring, and seeking to document African-American cemeteries, and particularly Pennsylvania's African-American cemeteries. So I wanted to take a few minutes tonight to share with you a few thoughts on what we can learn from preserving and studying African-American burial grounds, and why it's so important that we do take steps to protect and preserve them. And I'd like to start this story here at Fort Hunter. Before I get started, I would like to just say a quick shout out. I saw there's a Derek listed on the attendees tonight, and that may be Derek Weiss, who was a former student of mine a few years back, who was the one who shared with me initially about Fort Hunter's cemetery. And he also put together a great blog that talks about the Fort Hunter Cemetery. So if you want to know more about it, I'd look for that online. He worked for a while here at Fort Hunter. And I'm just very indebted to Derek, but also this is not a unique subject. I am very well aware that many people who, with the county, with the state, with Fort Hunter, have explored the history and studied the history of slavery and the cemetery at Fort Hunter. And so I'm very indebted to all of them for this research. So when we're talking about Fort Hunter, Revolutionary War Captain Archibald McAllister and his second wife Elizabeth purchased Fort Hunter in 1787. McAllister was one of the area's largest slaveholders, and he's also distinctive because he was one of the last slaveholders in the area. His family would be the owners of Fort Hunter until the 1870s. In 1828, fully 48 years after Pennsylvania had passed its gradual emancipation law in 1780, McAllister sought to sell off his 4 remaining slaves. One of the things that, just a quick aside, Pennsylvania was very early in abolishing slavery, but they were also, Pennsylvania as a state was very conservative in how it approached abolishing slavery. So men and women who were enslaved before 1780 remained slaves for the rest of their lives. Their children would remain slaves until their 28th birthday. And so when McAllister was selling his slaves in 1828, he was selling 3 of them who were people who had time remaining on their time as enslaved people, and 1 who was a slave for life. What we know about those 4 slaves come from an advertisement he posted on December 9th, 1828, to sell those 4 humans. He described one as, quote, a female aged about 20 years, has 8 years to serve. She understands all kinds of housework and is stout and healthy. A second was, quote, a male aged 24 years, has 4 years to serve, remarkably stout and healthy, and understands all kinds of farming, whatever. A third was, quote, a female aged 22, has 6 years to serve, stout and healthy, understands all kinds of housework, a good cook and ironer. In short, she understands every kind of work that belongs to a respectable family, unquote. And then the fourth slave was described as a female, quote, aged about 61 years, strong and active of her age. She is an excellent washer, baker, and cook, and understands the management of a dairy and soap boiling. Another notice posted about 2 weeks later by McAllister gave a name to that 61-year-old woman who was strong and active and very ambitious in terms of Sal Craig decided that she was going to run away from Fort Hunter, and McAllister offered a reward for her capture and return. We don't know what became of Sal Craig, but we do know that she was likely the matriarch of the Craig family that began their time at Fort Hunter in servitude, but continued to live and work at Fort Hunter after they gained their freedom. When some of them died, they were buried with their family members on the grounds of the Fort Hunter estate. Today, there are 2 cemeteries with a historical connection to Fort Hunter. Both of them have been orphaned from the original heart of the property, the park today. The one, which was the McAllister family property, is actually now at on the way to the Susquehanna Township compost facility, and it's situated between Highway 22 and the Norfolk Southern Railroad tracks. The African American cemetery is then on the other side of the other side of the railroad tracks on land that today is owned by the Country Club of Harrisburg. The McAllister family cemetery these are some images of the McAllister family cemetery with the stone wall. On the bottom left there is the tombstone of Archibald McAllister. And then from this cemetery, if you head east through brush and woods over the railroad tracks, you come to the Fort Hunter African American Cemetery. This cemetery is where you can discover, and by the way, I should say, I would discourage people from visiting both because of the danger and the ticks of getting to this particular place. But here at the cemetery, you really come face to face with the Craig family. At this site, it's believed are buried Andrew, Rachel, Reuben, John, Hannah, Cyrus, Andrew Edward, and Amelia Craig, as well as a couple of others as well. The county, I believe, or the park did ground penetrating radar in 2014 and found a total of 9 graves at this site, 5 marked and 4 unmarked. Obviously, when we see these 2 cemeteries, there's a number of things that we think about. One of the things that I think about when I see a cemetery like this is I'm first and foremost, I consider it a small miracle that this cemetery continues to exist on this site, is as intact as it currently is. Over the last several years, one of the projects that I've been working on is trying to find small rural African American cemeteries. And I can tell you that scattered across the state, there are many that have fallen into complete disrepair, that have vanished into the woods and undergrowth, that have been cleared or destroyed to develop land, build parks, parking lots, commercial developments, residential developments, others that have just been battered by the relentless elements and some by thoughtless vandals. The fact that this particular cemetery endures after more than 150 years since the first burial is a really powerful sacred testament. And I know that there are many people who have put time and effort into maintaining it and dealing with some of the challenges that it has faced over time. But for me, this is a spot that is a powerful sacred testament. The men and women who lay here, some of whom were born at Fort Hunter, lived their lives at Fort Hunter, and ended their lives, are buried here in this soil. Their lives and their spirits are deeply entwined with the history of this place, this county, this state. One of the things, of course, if we're thinking about lessons here, it's an obvious lesson that we can't overlook, that for a little community, there are two small cemeteries very close together, but so far apart. It seems striking and almost unnecessary that the relatively small community at Fort Hunter felt it necessary to have two separate cemeteries. But as we find throughout Pennsylvania, as we find throughout the nation, racism is often very powerful. And the same desire that kept African Americans separate in life, those in positions of authority sought to keep that separation into death as well. We also obviously see two very different styles of cemeteries here, very different condition, very different landscapes. But one of the things that I want you to consider here is that while these two cemeteries are symbols of racism and separation, it's also important for us to think about this Craig Cemetery as a space, a landscape, a piece of sacred ground shaped and nurtured and defined by free African American hands. It's a place where African Americans defined the dimensions and layout of the burial ground, a place where relatives gathered, bound by their own beliefs, their own love, their faith, the customs that they used to honor their dead and lay them to rest. Whatever flowers, prayers, sacred connection between the living and the dead, this was a space that was truly a space defined and controlled by the African Americans here at Fort Hunter. It's an entry point for us to get to know these individuals, their names, their identities, their lives. And the cemetery exists as a powerful space, a tangible physical evidence that the African American men and women who were here at Fort Hunter were not stories on names on a page or stories on a signpost, but living, breathing human beings who once walked the same landscape and who were laid to rest in the ground where they lived and worked. This cemetery, I should mention, is extremely fragile, both in terms of its physical elements, but also in terms of its existence looking to the future. It could be easily swallowed up by the forest around it, but it also doesn't exist as a legal entity. It has no deed, no legal protection to guard its existence. It is here with us today after 150 years through luck, through happenstance, through the efforts of many people who lent their hands to keep it intact. And it's on the edge of a lot, which the owner could really choose to do many different things with that lot. One of the things that, for those of us who work in this area of cemetery preservation, one of the things we know is that this is not something that's unique to Pennsylvania. This is actually a national issue that throughout the country right now, there are historic cemeteries not only being badly maintained, but regularly being destroyed, being developed, being really transformed from sacred spaces for the rest of the dead into 1,000 other commercial purposes. So as a matter of history, as a matter of preservation, as a matter of justice, as a matter of honoring and respecting the dead, and as a vital matter of preventing the intentional or unintentional erasing of African American history from our collective landscape, it is essential that sites like this one be preserved. Over the last few years here in Pennsylvania, I've had the privilege to work with an amazing group of people who make up the Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds. There's also others scattered across both Pennsylvania and the country who have made it their mission, who have decided to give their time, their money, their energy to maintaining, preserving, protecting African American cemeteries. For me, the Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds, this was a group that originally got its beginning in the period around 2005, 2006, as planning began to happen for the sesquicentennial of the Civil War and special efforts to make sure to honor the Civil War veterans from Pennsylvania, the African American Civil War veterans, especially the members of the United States Colored Troops. And one of the ways that was going to be done was to find their burial sites and honor them. Lenwood Sloan, who's pictured on the left there, spearheaded a lot of this work with a really team of amazing people. And the idea of finding the graves and honoring Civil War veterans became more complicated by the fact that so many of these cemeteries were lost, overgrown, in poor condition, and that a major effort was needed just to try to find them. In that initial effort, there were about 42 cemeteries identified, but over the last several years, this work has picked up, and we've identified over 100 African American cemeteries across the state, and probably twice that number of cemeteries that have United States Colored Troops buried on their grounds. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that in terms of protecting cemeteries, I'm going to give you my recipe for cemetery preservation, and I'm going to call this the 4 L's. Because when you find these cemeteries, and there's so many of these cemeteries that reflect communities that once existed that don't exist anymore, that reflect sites that don't have a community, that don't have a perpetual care fund, that what I like to say is that there's sort of 4 things that go into saving these sites. The first is love, that when it comes to historic preservation, we really need to make a commitment to preserve those things that we care about. And so finding people who care about a site, getting them together, that passion, that sense that this is something worth preserving is the first of the 4 L's. Second, it's a lot of work. Sometimes it's physical preservation of a site. Other times it's trying to raise money, reach out to the community, do educational work. There's a lot of work that goes into this. And for most folks who maintain cemeteries, the weekly, monthly work of mowing the grass, trimming trees, taking care of vegetation is a never-ending process that takes labor or the ability to get people involved with the project. Law is really important as well, because like when you look at a cemetery like the Fort Hunter Cemetery, if that's going to be maintained in perpetuity, there needs to be a legal steps taken to give it a distinct legal status so that it can be protected and designated as something to be preserved. And then my 4th L is lucre, which is basically money. That it is, there is always either money needs to be raised or donated or given in kind to make this work happen. Cemeteries, unlike other kinds of historic preservation, if you have a historic building, you can adapt it and use it for a new purpose. Cemeteries do not have an opportunity to be adapted and reused to become income generating properties. So there needs to be external money. And one of the things that we've seen in other places, for example, Oregon, Maryland is now considering a new law. There have been sites set up to allocate public funding, but in a lot of cases, there are municipalities, there are counties, there are cities, there are churches that are providing the money to make this happen. In Shippensburg, the VFW has been very generous in helping to maintain the African American cemetery. So I wanted to take just a couple of minutes here and to just show you a little bit about some of the work that is currently going on around the state, because I think one of the things that's important is for us to both think about what's happening, what has happened, and that also what these sites being protected really lends us in terms of understanding American history and the history of our communities. There's a great example just down the road in Swatara Township. My good friend Barbara Barksdale, since 1993, has been working with the Middletown Cemetery. That is a cemetery where she, in 1993, went to the cemetery with her 11-year-old son and saw that it was completely overgrown, and has spent almost 3 decades not only maintaining those grounds, clearing those grounds, celebrating those grounds, educating the community about those grounds, and really working together with a community to make that a place where people can come, show respect to their ancestors, but also learn about the community's African American history. I also, in Shippensburg, I've had the privilege to work with the Shippensburg Locust Grove Cemetery Committee. This committee has been in operation for well over 100 years, maintaining and preserving the African American cemetery in the community. I was very privileged to get involved in the early 2000s and have almost been involved for 20 years. And both Dave Marr, who I saw is here tonight, he and many others but he in particular, and Charles Evans, spent a lot of time working to preserve and conserve some of the tombstones, to get a fence, to celebrate the history here. But this has been, again, a huge community effort. The Shippensburg Historical Society, the Corn Festival, children from the schools, churches have pitched in and helped to really both preserve this site and to make it a place where we can recognize and connect to the community's African American history that dates all the way back to the early Republic. One of the other just things to mention about the Locust Grove Cemetery, in 1861, when Spring Hill Cemetery was established in Shippensburg, it became clear that that public cemetery, in its founding documents, would not allow people who were not white to be buried in the community's public cemetery. And so it was not until 1996 that the first African American person was buried in the Spring Hill Cemetery in Shippensburg. So this separation is not something we just see in Fort Hunter, but something that we see throughout Pennsylvania. I wanted to just point out a couple of other cemeteries quickly. The Perkins Dennis Cemetery in Susquehanna Township, up in the northern tier of Pennsylvania, is a pretty amazing cemetery. The Dennis family has set up a land trust and has done amazing work to preserve both the farm and the cemetery on the site. The Perkins Dennis Cemetery and the Dennis farm was settled by Prince Perkins, who was a Revolutionary War soldier who came from Connecticut to Pennsylvania in 1793. And his family has owned this property ever since. So when we think about Pennsylvania history and African American history, this is a great site for us to think about the fact that here's a free Black coming to Pennsylvania, establishing a farm, a Revolutionary War veteran, building a new life here in Pennsylvania. We also, one of the things that I think is important is that cemeteries across the state mark the importance of Pennsylvania, both as a refuge for slaves and people who were freed from the South coming north to make new lives, but also as a path on the Underground Railroad. There are 2 cemeteries in the state, both of which are called Freedom Road. One of which is in Williamsport, the other is in Stonesboro, Pennsylvania, Mercer County. The Williamsport Cemetery is pretty amazing because there was a man by the name of Daniel Hughes who ran a raft on the Susquehanna and actually would smuggle slaves up the Susquehanna to Williamsport and actually established an African-American community in Williamsport. In Stonesboro, again, it was a route on the Underground Railroad, and starting in the 1820s, you see a Black community developing in Western Pennsylvania, Mercers County, of slaves either leaving from the South when they were freed or coming, especially runaway slaves, coming to Pennsylvania to create a new life. What's interesting about the Freedom Road in Mercer County is that when in 1850, when the Compromise of 1850 was passed with the Fugitive Slave Law, a lot of those slaves that were runaway slaves that had settled in Mercer County subsequently left for Canada out of fear that they would be apprehended. But that cemetery is still there, continues to be used to this day, showing a really incredible connection back to the 19th century and back to that early history of runaway slaves coming to Pennsylvania to start new lives. We also, if you travel around the state and think about the different industries of different parts of the state, you can also see how African Americans were intertwined into different industries, different communities. The iron industry, for example, the Mount Frisbee AME Zion Church, which is at Hopewell Furnace, was actually founded by African Americans who worked at the furnace in the iron works. Here in Cumberland County, the Irishtown Cemetery, which is in Penn Township, which is now a ghost town. None of the original buildings, there's a single marker left from the church that was there, was an African American community that developed charcoal for the Pine Grove furnace. And again, this African American community closely connected to the iron industry, living in the side of the South Mountain. Another iron industry community that I just wanted to touch on, in Franklin County, there's an area called Brownsville, also known as Africa. Franklin County actually has 2 communities called Africa, both of which were settled by runaway slaves. In the case of Africa, Franklin County, by Caledonia State Park today, it was connected to Thaddeus Stevens's Irons Works. It's actually about a mile, and you have to go down 30 and then up into the hills. But it was an African American community of African Americans who were directly connected to Thaddeus Stevens Iron Works. And one of the things that Thaddeus Stevens was very deliberate about was using the ironworks as a way to create jobs and employment. And in this case, it was employment for this African American community that was both composed of runaway slaves, but also is well documented as a stop on the Underground Railroad. One of the other things that I think is really important about the African American cemeteries across the state is, as you visit these different cemeteries, one of the things that you will find in so many of them are the graves of Civil War soldiers. Pennsylvania as a state of the northern states during the Civil War, Pennsylvania had the highest number of African Americans serving in the Civil War. And those African Americans went back after the war. Some came from other parts of the country and settled, but they are literally scattered in the cemeteries across our state. And the cemeteries are a place for us to recognize them and connect to that history. Zion Union Cemetery in Mercersburg is somewhat distinctive. It has the largest number of veterans of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. The 54th Massachusetts, if you're familiar with the movie Glory, was one of the very first units that allowed African Americans to serve in the Civil War. There was recruiting done for the 54th Massachusetts Regiment in Pennsylvania. And one of the amazing facts is that when you look at the composition of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the largest number of troops came from Boston. The second largest number of African American troops came from Bedford, Massachusetts, then Philadelphia, and then Franklin County, Pennsylvania. And so the Zion Union Cemetery is a great place to recognize that really remarkable history. But there are other cemeteries around the state that similarly have the graves of United States colored troops. In Mechanicsburg, Upper Allen Township on Winding Hill Road, if you're driving along and you see trees off in the middle of a distant field, that is the Upper Allen Lincoln Cemetery, where again, there are United States colored troops buried there, as well as other members of the Mechanicsburg community. And that cemetery has been maintained by the Vietnam veterans of Mechanicsburg, who have really taken that on as something that they believe is important to protect and preserve. There's other cemeteries, Freedom Hill, which is also called Spriggs Cemetery in McConnellsburg, Pennsylvania. This tiny little cemetery in the woods in McConnellsburg, Pennsylvania, is the final resting place of African Americans of the community, including James and Jeremiah Spriggs. And their descendants, plus some alumni of Shippensburg University, chipped in, bought this land to protect it and preserve it, and to let people know that this is sacred ground where African American Civil War veterans are buried. There are other sites around the state that also tell other important stories. The Mount Tabor Church and Cemetery in Mount Holly Springs, and the date, I have 1868, but it may be earlier. This is a community that the Gumby family in particular, but there's others who connect to this. This little African-American community on the side of the mountain in Mount Holly Springs persisted and really flourished after the United States Civil War. Elias Parker, who was a slave originally born in Jefferson County, Virginia, he moved to Williamsport, Maryland, served in the United States Colored Troops, and then in 1886 moved to Mount Holly, was instrumental in both helping to establish the Mount Tabor Church, as well as the cemetery that's still there on those grounds. Just a couple of years ago, if you went there, the church was covered with vines and the trees were growing around it. The cemetery has been really quite remarkably maintained, but the community has pitched in and has done amazing work to stabilize the building, to put up a fence, to clean the tombstones, to really bring new life to that site. And amazingly, and congratulations, shout out to the folks of Mount Tabor and Mount Holly Springs and the Cumberland County Historical Society and the Mount Holly community and the borough of Mount Holly that have done so much work to build community support, preserve that site, and it's now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I'd also like to give a shout out to the State Historic Preservation Office, which also helped to make that nomination happen. So it's a really impressive effort that has really had a big impact over the last few years. There's other cemeteries around the state. Historic Bucktow Cemetery in Kenneth Square. Bucktow was a church and cemetery that was established in 1824 in Kenneth Square, PA, by the African Union Church. This was an African-American church and community that thrived until the early 20th century, when it's believed that the Ku Klux Klan burned the church down. The cemetery was badly overgrown, but in 2010, largely through the efforts of the New Garden Memorial United AME Church, Crystal Compton, and a number of others who were really a dynamic force bringing to bear to really preserve and protect this cemetery. And pictured down below there is also Eugene Huff, who was very helpful in terms of his work trying to protect the site. And especially one of the things that had happened here was either that a number of the graves had not been marked, or that the markers had been removed. And he actually helped to cast and remark the graves and locate the graves of the Civil War veterans buried at that cemetery. Right now, there is an incredible effort going on in York County, PA, by the Friends of Lebanon Cemetery, who have been doing amazing work, literally uncovering tombstones and markers from the ground. But the other thing that the Friends of Lebanon Cemetery have been doing has been some really amazing work uncovering and documenting the history of the people who are buried in York County's largest African-American cemetery. So not only does the cemetery itself become a more important and presentable and respectful place for African-American burials, but the cemetery itself has become like a library and a genealogical resource and a historical resource to really be a focal point for telling the community's African-American history. There are other cemeteries around the state. This is an example at the Zion AME Church in Devon, PA. There's been great work going on at that church and cemetery, trying to uncover more of its history, but also bringing in, connecting to, in this case, it's an archaeologist from the University of Pennsylvania Museum who's been using remote sensing technology to try to find graves that may have been lost over time and make sure that they are discovered and acknowledged and preserved appropriately. And then I have to give a shout out to Eden Cemetery. If you're not familiar with Eden Cemetery, Eden Cemetery is also on the National Register of Historic Places. I didn't mention that Devon Cemetery is also on the National Register of Historic Places. Eden Cemetery was started at the beginning of the 20th century as an African-American cemetery, as many of the African-American cemeteries in Philadelphia were being closed or shut down. It actually is remarkable because not only was it important for African-Americans to try to find a place to bury their dead, but when the very first cemetery, very first funeral was taking place, the white community of Collingsdale actually blocked the funeral from taking place because they were opposed to the idea of having an African-American cemetery in their community. But one of the things that Eden Cemetery, it has, as various African-American cemeteries in Philadelphia have shut down for one reason or another, it has actually brought those burials to Eden Cemetery. And so now there are over 90,000 African-American burials in Eden Cemetery. And the records of those burials are a treasure trove in terms of the information they provide about African-American history, African-American genealogy. And Eden Cemetery has been doing an amazing project. I'd encourage you to Google their website. They're doing an amazing project in cooperation with Ancestry.com to digitize a lot of their records and really make that history, that cemetery, those cemetery records, that African-American history more accessible to more people. So one of the other things that I just wanted to mention is I've only touched on a handful of cemeteries. But literally, we are discovering new cemeteries every year. Just earlier, at the end of 2020, the city of Easton was trying to do a study to look at its pocket parks in the city and trying to think about ways that they could better utilize those and make them more valuable to the community. And one of the things that was discovered through the process of research and engaging the community is that one of the pocket parks was actually built on what had previously been an African American cemetery. And what's really, great, and so on one hand, this is really troubling that in the 1920s, the community devastated this cemetery and built a park. But on the other hand, this is an opportunity where the community, that there's a lot of interest right now in this park, in that African American history, in thinking about how to tell the stories and really bringing back African American history to this neighborhood, to the city in a new way. And so as we're thinking about what lessons can we learn from African American cemeteries, I would just say that this is I feel like I have just, scratched the surface here. But as we're thinking about, what are the lessons that we learned? First, I would say that it really, to quote that African proverb, it really does take a village to make this happen. But I would say it takes all of us in the village. This is a job that we all have to see as part of our work, to protect, to preserve, and honor African American history, because this is part of our history, American history. And this is something that is not something we can really wait or hope that other people do. That we either have to make a commitment as a society to preserve and protect our African American cemeteries, or we have to accept that they're going to disappear, because this is about dignity, it's about respect, it's about preserving and ensuring and documenting African American history, and ensuring that there's the enthusiasm, the resources, the commitment, the love, the labor, the law, and the lucre to ensure that these precious resources that tell so much about our history and really are places where we honor generations of our dead are not allowed to be destroyed or lost forever. And I'm just gonna, as a last little plug, if you are interested in this work, probably the easiest way to connect to the Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds is through the group's Facebook page. If you're on Facebook and you look for PA Hallowed Grounds, it's easy to find. The group does have an annual meeting, but is also really interested in connecting and working with other groups to make this work happen. So thank you. That's, I'll stop and be glad to answer any questions, or if other people have comments, or I know there's a lot of people on this call tonight who are also deeply involved in this work as well.
Hi, Dr. Burg. We have a few questions on here. The first one is from Gary. What was the remote sensing method used in the cemetery?
So the picture there of Bertha, that was actually magnetic sensing. That wasn't ground penetrating radar, although other cemeteries have worked with ground penetrating radar, but that was actually magnetic sensing that they were doing there. I know Barbara Barksdale in Steelton has been doing work with ground penetrating radar, but there have been a lot of other folks who have been using ground penetrating radar as well.
Cool, thank you. Let's see, Derek says, thanks, Dr. Berg. Oh wait, hang on, they're rolling in here. Sounds like the fate of Saul Craig is still unknown, but have any sources come to light that reveal anything more about her life or the family more generally? Are there any descendants still living in the area?
I'm gonna first, Derek, thanks for the question. I actually, I would ask, I don't know if there's others in the audience who may know more about that than I do. So I will, I don't know more than that, but if there are others who do and want to post that in the chat, that would be
Okay.
great to have that information.
Okay. David and Carla, I'm with the Lower Paxton Township Historical Commission. We have a church that has a cemetery where white people were buried in a maintained cemetery, and all African American individuals were buried just west and not maintained, and now lies in the woods. Just east of the church was a Black Masonic orphanage, which started in the early 1920s, and we feel there may be a small cemetery there, and we have full support of the Masons. May I contact you?
Yes, please. I would be enthusiastic to have you contact me. So please do. And what I'll do is I'll put my email in the chat here.
Okay.
So please feel free to get in touch. I would love to know more about that.
Cool. Mary says, I am curious now about the African American cemetery outside of Middletown in Dauphin County.
Okay. Yeah. I have to apologize because literally there are 100 cemeteries across, at least 100 that we know of, and it sounds like now it's 101. But each of the cemeteries is really going to, in so many ways, tell the history of its community. I know that there's a group that works with the Middletown Cemetery. I don't know if anybody else who's on the call today wanted to talk more to that, but I know that they have been doing really good work trying to maintain that site. I think there's actually 2 cemeteries in Middleton, if I'm correct. But
Okay, thank you. Derek has another question. Can you talk a little bit about the cemetery near Chambersburg? Can't remember the name. Sorry if you mentioned it.
yeah, no, I didn't. So the Chambersburg has an it actually had more than one African American cemetery. There's a African American cemetery connected with the AME church downtown. There had been a second church cemetery downtown, but the big African American cemetery in Chambersburg is actually a 2-part cemetery. It's the Mount Vernon and Lebanon cemeteries. They're really interesting because Chambersburg, there was a wealthy woman who, I'm blanking on her name right now, but she actually purchased land. McClellan was her name, and she actually purchased land on the outskirts of Chambersburg, by the area that today, if you're familiar with Chambersburg, is Radio Hill, and actually paid for there to be buildings and houses set up there to house freed and runaway slaves in that area. And then right after the Civil War, she donated the land to create a African American cemetery for that community that then became the main community cemetery for African Americans in the Chambersburg area. So there's actually the older cemeteries, the Mount Vernon, and then there's the newer part of the cemetery is the Lebanon Cemetery.
All right, thank you. Let's see who's next. Nancy. Does the U.S. military do any veteran cemetery work for African American cemeteries?
So the thing that, and I want to make sure that I'm not speaking out of turn here, but one of the things that has been very important has been for the cemeteries where there are unmarked graves of veterans, that if you have a family member who can, and you can document their military service, that it has been possible to get tombstones for those veterans. But as far as I'm aware, that there are some county veteran offices that do provide some support to the graves of veterans, but it's not a consistent thing across the state.
Okay. Maggie is wondering if you have any recommended reading for those who would like to know more about the African American cemeteries in Pennsylvania.
Wow, that's a great question. Maggie, I'm going to have to think about that. I'm trying to think of the one of the things that has been interesting so far is that so many of there are a number of books about local communities. They're just, I keep discovering these local histories. But I have to think about what I would recommend as, yeah, there's not, off the top of my head, I'm not sure what I would recommend.
Okay,
Sorry about that.
Maggie, if you comment an email address, we can follow up with you if there's any suggestions we come up with. Ken, okay, this is a question for more of the friends, and I'm not sure if anyone on here, maybe Carl, would be able to answer. Have the Friends of Fort Hunter approached the board of Harrisburg Country Club about preservation efforts of the cemetery on the property?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. We are in discussions with the country club, so yes.
Oh, okay. Great. Stephanie, hi, in Gettysburg, there is an African cemetery where my grandparents are buried. Do you know anything about this cemetery?
Yeah, so in Gettysburg, there is the Lincoln Cemetery, which I want to say was founded. There had been an earlier cemetery in Gettysburg. The one that currently exists, which is right near the hospital, which does have a historical marker, and there was a great project. I guess it was probably in the early 2000s or late 90s to restore that cemetery, put up a fence, put up signage there. That cemetery, if you're interested in the history of it, I think it's Betsy Myers, has written a book about it, which is called Segregated in Death. It's sometimes hard to come across, but there is a book about that, and the history, it's like the history of so many other communities in Pennsylvania. That cemetery, I think it was the Friends of Goodwill was the organization that established it, which was a sort of community fraternal organization in Gettysburg. But it was really after the other cemetery was no longer in use, they established that cemetery, I want to say after the Civil War, and then it has been really had that major restoration about 20 years ago.
Okay. And Ken followed up in the comments with that as well and said that Troy Harmon from the Gettysburg National Military Park has done some research that he shared on a battlefield walk. So he might be able to help.
Yeah, well. There is a lot of information about the Lincoln Cemetery. So if you Google Lincoln Cemetery Gettysburg, there's a number of websites that have information. There's also another really interesting cemetery near Gettysburg, which has largely, there's not much left of it, but it was the Yellow Hill community outside of Gettysburg, which was a Quaker influenced community, around Yellow Hill. And Deb McCausland has actually written a book on the Yellow Hill Cemetery.
Great. Zach is doing some research with a colleague in regards to connecting Freedom Road in Williamsport on the path to Canton and then to Buffalo. Any words of wisdom as we work on this?
Words of wisdom. I think it sounds like a great project. I think that the there's just so much research to be done. And I think one of the things that one of the things that I have been trying to do is that so many of these projects take place in isolation or are very local. And it's hard then to really gain an appreciation for the sheer, connectedness of all of this, that the communities are connected, the AME churches are connected, the people are connected. But I would love to see what you come up with, because it's, I've done some research on the Underground Railroad in Franklin County, and you find bits and pieces, but obviously it was a secret operation, and a lot of it was not terribly well orchestrated. So, putting all the pieces together. But that sounds like a great project, and I wish you well, and just keep sharing your work as you do it, because we need to know more about all of this history.
Great. If anyone else has any last questions here, I will try and get them in. It's 8 o'clock, so I just want to be considerate of everyone's time. But I also do want to remind everybody that's on here today, I think we have about 60 participants, which is awesome. This is only our second virtual lecture series that we've done, the Friends of Fort Hunter here, and we really appreciate everyone that is logged on tonight, and anyone who might be interested in becoming a member of Fort Hunter to help support future programs like this. You can find that information on forthunter.org on our website. And this is being recorded. I'm not sure, Michelle, how we are able to see that after the fact.
Sorry, I'll be sending it out via email, and it'll be on our social media outlets as well as Fort Hunter's Parks website.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I think that's it for the questions. And Dr. Burg, we thank you so much for sharing this information with us and for spending this time with us tonight.
It was my pleasure, and I just want to thank everybody. And I've again, so many students and former students. It was wonderful. I feel bad that we didn't get to see each other in person, but hopefully when we're post-pandemic, we can do that too. But and thank you to everybody who's doing this work across the state, because it really is one of those, I feel like there's so many independent efforts taking place that I just scratched the surface in terms of all the work that's currently happening. So, and thank you, Barbara, for the invitation.
Oh, and you're welcome. And I just wanted to say thank you again. I see a lot of people are saying how much they enjoyed it. And I'm sure there will be some more discussion at people's own various friends and colleagues. And it seems like a lot of people know other people on here, as some of your contacts were on here. And as you said to me earlier tonight, only in COVID, the upside is you could have a national presentation on a Wednesday night, which doesn't always happen, as we know, trying to organize things in person. So, but thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for joining us, and stay tuned, because we hopefully will be planning more of these kinds of events with the Friends of Fort Hunter. Good evening, everyone.